Morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Former South Dakota Senator, Democrat George McGovern, died this morning at a hospice in Sioux Falls. McGovern was an influential leader for a generation of American liberals, running for president and losing to Richard Nixon in 1972. George McGovern was 90 years old, prophetic voice for peace, a decorated war hero, and we mourn his passing. And the White House last night denied a New York Times report that Iran and the United States had agreed to one-on-one nuclear talks. We'll have that story later in the show. Right now, joining me today, we have Ali Gharib, senior editor for the blog Open Zion on the Daily Beast, where he writes about America's Middle East policies. Anne-Marie Slaughter, professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, and the former director of policy planning for the Obama State Department. Joe Sestak, former Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, retired three-star admiral and former director of defense policy for the Clinton National Security Council. And Elise Jordan, former speechwriter to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and former National Security Council official. The defining moment of Tuesday night's presidential debate came during an exchange between President Obama and Mitt Romney on last month's attack on the American consulate in Benghazi, Libya. The issue had been seen as a slam dunk for Romney, but quickly turned into a political disaster.
The day after the attack, Governor, I stood in the Rose Garden, and I told the American people and the world that we were going to find out exactly what happened, that this was an act of terror.
I think it's interesting the president just said something which is that on the day after the attack, he went to the Rose Garden and said that this was an act of terror.
That's what I said.
You said in the Rose Garden, the day after the attack, it was an act of terror. It was not a spontaneous demonstration. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're saying?
Please proceed, Governor.
I want to make sure we get that for the record, because it took the president 14 days before he called the attack in Benghazi an act of terror.
Get the transcript.
He did, in fact, sir. So let me call it an act of terror.
Can you say that a little louder, Candy?
After that, Romney dropped Libya from his stump speech and has not mentioned it since. Just because he backed away from the talking about Benghazi does not mean there aren't still unanswered questions about what happened. On Thursday night, Jon Stewart tried to get at that point during an interview with the president.
The difficulty, the perception seemed to be that State was on a different page than you, or that you had Susan Rice 5 days afterwards saying on shows, well, this video and could have been a part of that, and then other
John,
people were.
The truth is that information comes in, folks put it out throughout the process. People say it's still incomplete.
It's part of the investigation, helping the communication between these divisions of security, not just what happened in Benghazi, but what happened within. Because I don't know, I would say even you would admit it was not the optimal response, at least to the American people, as far as us all being on the same page.
Well, here's what I'll say.
Yeah.
If 4 Americans get killed, it's not optimal.
Right.
And we're going to fix it.
Right.
And
all of it.
All of it. And what happens during the course of a presidency is that the government is a big operation. At any given time, something screws up, and you make sure that you find out what's broken and you fix it.
The information coming out about the attacks is no less confusing now. Several reports over the past week seem to corroborate, at least partially, the Obama administration's early accounts of the attack being precipitated by an anti-Muslim video on YouTube, an account, I should note, they have since distanced themselves from. Adding another twist to the story, on Friday, anonymous administration officials accused Republican Congressman Darrell Issa, chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, of endangering several Libyans who have been secretly working with the U.S. by not redacting their names when he released 166 pages of unclassified but sensitive Libya-related documents. Heading into tomorrow night's foreign policy debate, the details of what happened in Benghazi on September 11th are, I have to say, more confusing to me as a consumer of news than they have ever been. We talked about this pretty early on, and I will put myself in the category of people who were troubled by what seemed to be a distance between what the reporting and what the intelligence agencies seemed to be saying and what was coming out of the White House. And I thought that gap was worrisome, and we talked about it in the show. I don't know what to think anymore, because what looked like at first was the official U.S. government line was that this was spontaneous and in reaction to the video. And there was a parallel channel of reporting that seemed to be indicating this was premeditated. It was the work of possibly al-Qaeda militants and had nothing to do with the video. In fact, there was no protest of the video. So that was what happened. Now we have reporting from the LA Times and the New York Times who are talking to people in Benghazi who are all saying Nah, dude, it was a video. Here's LA Times. The assault was opportunistic. No evidence of an al-Qaeda link. The assault on the U.S. diplomatic mission in Benghazi last month appears to have been an opportunistic attack rather than a long-planned operation, and intelligence agencies have found no evidence that it was ordered by al-Qaeda, according to U.S. officials and witnesses interviewed in Libya. Here is my question to you. Has the media been punked by the right? I mean, did conservatives essentially generate a controversy where there was none? Because I am now beginning to think that was the case. And I am someone who on this program thought this is a very important issue. It seems there's this distance. And now I really don't know what to believe.
I think
guide me.
I don't think it is. I think it's fantastical to think that a video caused this. And I think that the administration...
But the people on the ground are saying that.
But at the end of the day, what are they protesting? They are storming an American consulate. It is about American policy.
Well, no, but
a policy that they are protesting against that they don't like. And we should have had a fortified defense. And Obama should have taken responsibility. But the whole problem, Obama had a chance to show presidential leadership in the 48-hour period afterwards. Romney also both abysmally failed.
But wait a second. That seems to me projecting onto, and I'm not saying that, obviously there is, I think one of the things that's been confusing about this story, right, is that we want to identify some cause, right? And that all stories must be mutually exclusive with each other. Either it was the video, or it was Ansar al-Sharia, or it was al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or it was premeditated, right? All of those things can be true concurrently. Right. So that's part of the problem, right?
It's a premeditated attack in reaction to the video.
Right, exactly.
By probably not al-Qaeda.
Right, but also by protesters who happen to be around with guns because the country is awash in guns. But I just want to respond one thing to this about it being American policy. I mean, I think at a certain level you have to take somewhat at face value what the people who pulled off the operation are saying. I mean, if they say we were doing this because of the video, I'm inclined to believe them. When Osama bin Laden said why he did 9/11, I'm inclined to believe that's why he did 9/11. We don't want the American troops in Saudi Arabia occupying the Holy Land or whatever. Why we're not going to project onto these folks what we think their motives were.
But
right?
to Lisa's point, I think there's two separate issues here. I think on the security issue,
right,
there's more than enough evidence to say that the administration did not handle this well. When you have a request come in for more security, whether it would have made a difference or not, after the UN office, the Red Cross office, the British ambassador, all been attacked in embassy, a hole had been blown in the wall of that compound, our consulate earlier. There should be accountability and responsibility by this administration on that. On the second issue, I think when Representative Thornberry, a Republican, on the House Intelligence Committee actually says, what the intelligence community was telling us, General Petraeus, is exactly what the administration was putting out to the public. People tend to forget, have worked in the National Security Council, headed Deep Blue, the Navy's anti-terrorism unit, that there are no one-armed intelligence officers. They're always saying on the one hand, but on the other hand.
Like
the issue is this.
Right.
It's hard for this assertion of conspiracy or anything, or to say that policy is unraveling, because intelligence agencies maybe didn't have it right. There is no assertion that can be made of conspiracy by these professionals. That's what's missing in this piece. General Petraeus misrepresenting something? No way.
No, and there's a way to square the circle here where it originally, if you said it was a spontaneous thing from a protest, it's what that sounded like was there's a protest going on outside the consulate, and then suddenly that escalated into, hey, let's take over the consulate and let's kill them. Then people realized they had RPGs, and people do not demonstrate on the street without a video with RPGs. So then it looked like, okay, it must have been an attack. Then there was evidence that it could have, certainly you had the head of al-Qaeda calling for an attack. They looked like they were links. But then ultimately it is in reaction to the video, according to the people on the ground. But it was an attack that was spontaneous that day, not premeditated for weeks. So the people I talked to in Washington right after all said privately, we're still trying to figure out what was going on. This was really hard to figure out.
This is the thing. Admiral Sestak raises the point that there is a real sort of policy security issue here. And then above that, and the only thing we hear much about, is the political issues. And that is an instance of what you're talking about, Chris, where the rights attack really did work in the sense that in the immediate aftermath of the attack, Romney came out and attacked Obama and was denounced by everybody. Like Bill Kristol said he sounded unpresidential. Denounced by everybody. But what it did is it forced the administration to take this from an issue where they could make these sort of mild-mannered on the one hand, on the other hand comments, and it made them commit to a line. And they went out there and they pushed that line on every Sunday talk show.
Okay, but Yes, but there's also,
I just think President Obama's passivity on this issue has just been, quite frankly, a disgusting response. I can't believe he went on Jon Stewart. He'll go on Jon Stewart. He'll go on The View. He'll say it's not optimal for someone to get killed. He needs to show leadership.
He was repeating. I mean, the not optimal thing, Jon Stewart.
Yeah, but he hasn't really.
He stood up and said, "I'm commander-in-chief. Absolutely, I'm responsible."
Right. Very evasive during the debate. He did not answer the question.
I thought that was like one of the strongest moments of the whole debate.
I thought Romney gave him such a huge gift by completely.
Well, I think we're all in agreement on that, but I don't think he was passive.
That was the moment where
I'm with Anne-Marie. He stood up and said, "I take full responsibility."
Why will Obama not say this was an act of war against America?
Wait, I want to address that. I want to address that because it seems to me they want
to downplay this Libya.
No, that's the question.
Perfect intervention in Libya. You can go to war. You can intervene in the Middle East without any cost.
That's the deeper question. I want to talk about that because it seems like there's moving semantic goalposts. They have to say act of terror now. They have to say act of war. I don't know, like most horrendous act that ever happened in the history of civilization. I mean, I want to be clear about what we are asking of the president to do when you say passivity right after we take this break. Elise, you raised, I think, an important and provocative question before we went to break is, are we at war with Libya? I mean, that when you say this is an act of war, are we at war in Libya? I don't think we're at war with Libya, but are we at war in Libya? And this is kind of a profound definitional question because there was some debate about whether the president had the authority to order the intervention in Libya. There were some noises coming from Congress, although not a particularly strenuous effort to make sure that it didn't happen. And it gets to this point of security, right? I mean, yes. If we get off this sort of what happened when timeline, and I think we're maybe at consensus at the table that there are a bunch of facts stacked atop each other which are not mutually exclusive, and that accounts for some of the confusion, right, in the initial reports. In terms of diplomatic security, Ali, you were making a point during the break about private security contractors and the role that they had filled in previously in our long era of intervention in that region.
Yeah, so the thing about Libya is that Libya was not classified by the State Department as a war zone. And you can make whatever you want as that. It basically is a conflict zone because there are weapons around. Elise is right about that.
Tons of weapons.
But that's kind of how Libya is going to be for the next 100 years, right? 50, 100 years.
So bold prediction. Continue.
Libya is a conflict zone. I mean, that place is flooded with weapons. And then in the previous model, in these other places that were considered war zones, you had the super beefed up security with Blackwater private security contractors. These guys ran around. There was the Nisour Square massacre in Iraq. They killed a bunch of people. And now governments like Libya's new government don't want us to put these mercenary armies on the ground there. They consider that boots on the ground just the same as if they were U.S. Marines. Yep. And in fact, it's actually worse than U.S. Marines because there's no accountability for those people, as we saw from Blackwater's activities in the Bush years. There's no accountability to anyone. I mean, they do protect their charges. This is a point Elise made during the break, which is true. And it creates a conundrum for us because how do you protect people without those? We used to have the Diplomatic Security Service, which its sole job, I mean, the whole point of bolstering that service would be so that we could say it to governments like that in Libya, that, hey, we have a group of accountable American government employees
who are in the American chain of command,
whose sole job is to protect our diplomats abroad. But we've gutted that in favor of outsourcing it and having these unaccountable mercenaries.
But the real question, we've also cut the budget for it dramatically. We have diplomatic security, and they're extremely good. In fact, many diplomats complain all the time that they're too well protected. They can't do their jobs.
We've talked about that on the show.
Indeed, Ambassador Stevens wanted to be out there, but we've cut the budget. We've gutted the budget for the State Department as a whole.
You're absolutely right, Anne-Marie. It's been cut 10% since 2010. But the real issue is, what are the implications for the Arab Spring and for our positions there in Libya and Northern Africa? Are we headed in the general direction? And my argument is, yes, overall. We've established an AFRICOM, a military command over Africa, with more drones just being requested for that. It's not that we're at war there.
Right direction? That does not sound,
but it is, because we're understanding that Al-Qaeda has metastasized to some degree because 2/3 of Al-Qaeda's leadership had been decimated in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The issue is, however, when you look at Libya itself and understand that on the proportional representation in its recent legislature elections, the majority of those 100 that were elected We're moderates or secular.
Yeah.
Is it going to be spotty security? Is it going to be rough going? Absolutely. But as you look a little bit more towards the east and see that Morsi then went to Iran and said, hey, wait a moment. I may not always agree with the United States, but stop building a nuclear weapon. And number two, what's happening in Syria is outrageous. Right. You begin to say maybe we have an Egyptian Islamic government and a Turkish Islamic government that can begin becoming two strong bulwarks of owning the suitcase of problems more in the Arab world. And that can help us. So are we in the general right direction? Yeah. Is it going to be spotty? Yes. But so has it been in the past when 12 of our embassies were attacked during the Bush years and a diplomat was killed in Pakistan.
The case that the Romney-Ryan ticket is making, which is to use the example of what happened with the attack in the Benghazi consulate as this data point in a broader argument about the unraveling of the American foreign policy. Here's Vice Presidential candidate Paul Ryan making that case.
The Benghazi thing would be a tragedy in and of itself if it was an isolated incident. The problem is it's not simply an isolated incident, but a picture of a broader story of the absolute unraveling of the Obama administration's foreign policy. Go around the world and you see policy failure after policy failure, and that is something that they just can't defend.
I mean, that is the case in the Republicans, that this is part of that the tragedy in Benghazi indicates some broader failure in the Middle East.
Well, I think there are a lot of problems clearly today in the Middle East. Your question of weapons of mass destruction. Now, I just do not get why we intervened in Libya if we are trying to convince people to see their weapons of mass destruction. If you're the Iranians and you see we actually go in and intervene once you do give away your weapons of mass destruction, what incentive do you have?
I think that's an interesting provocative point, but let me just set the context for viewers who are not familiar with this, right? Of course, Gaddafi had a nuclear weapons program, and one of the big victories that was announced during the Bush administration, which they chalked up to the Iraq intervention, but I think was absolutely not the case. It was a lot of diplomacy actually by the EU, convinced Gaddafi to give up his nuclear weapons. He gave up his nuclear weapons, and there is a case to be made that what he did was he gave up his nuclear program, and a few years later, there were NATO bombs essentially deposing him, and that essentially is a bad nuclear non-proliferation.
Yeah, but to my point, I was actually not in support of the Libya intervention, first off. But that said, this unraveling issue kind of is amazing to me. I mean, here we are, having stopped this tragic war in Iraq, where our army could not respond to any other war plan throughout all of the world to defend South Korea, by testimony of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because they've done nothing but counterinsurgency training, to where a 4-star Marine Corps general said it's going to take us 10 years before we're ready to be back to handling all the combined arms around the world. Third, to have had a shift of our focus to the Western Pacific, to where our naval forces by this president are now 60% of our arms. Marines down in Australia. If you're a Democrat, some of them would now be saying, if there was a Republican president doing that, are you a warmonger? No, I don't think this is unraveling. This is beginning to stitch back the strength of the entire fabric of our national security.
This just sounds like hold that thought for a second. We just got to take a quick break. Come back after the break. Anne-Marie, I'm sorry that I cut you off to go to break, but you wanted to respond.
Libya, and I wanted to respond.
Yeah.
So I did support the intervention in Libya very strongly. I think it was the right thing to do. And I have to point out, in Libya, the fact that there was an attack on our consulate is nothing new. We've been having attacks on our consulates and our embassies for a long time. They have actually decreased, although I agree we needed more security. What's really different is that hundreds of thousands of Libyans took to the streets demonstrating against Ansar al-Sharia and holding signs saying, America, we are sorry. Right. So the reason we did this was because we had to support the opposition. We had to save a city that was possibly 700,000 people under attack. And Romney's position is completely incoherent because on the one hand, he's saying we ought to do more in Syria. He supported the intervention in Libya. We are reaping the harvest slowly. They're actually also opposed to the Chinese and to the Russians on oil. They're very pro-us. And yes, it's awash in weapons. Yes, it's fragile. It was always going to be. But we're actually beginning to see some of the fruits of our policy with respect to Libya and with respect to Egypt, not with respect to Syria.
And I would also say this. I think one of the things about Libya, and I myself have gone back and forth on this, on the Libya intervention, when you're looking at Syria, I mean, the problems in Libya, which is, militant groups and heavily militarized militias that have a lot of weapons, right, and a kind of balkanization that's happening and a power vacuum that happens in post-revolutionary environments. to the extent you chalk them up to the American intervention, which I think is somewhat fair because the Americans did lead an intervention, you now have Syria going on, and I think in some ways you're kind of running this experiment in parallel, right? We're almost certainly not going to intervene in Syria in the way we did in Libya, and what you're going to see is essentially the same set of problems. You're going to see, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-affiliated jihadis on the rise. You're going to see it awash in weapons. All of those things are happening without the American intervention. So I think to the extent that you chalk up those problems in Libya to the American intervention, Syria is a little bit of a counterexample just because those same issues are happening in Syria in the absence of it.
Yeah, I mean, the groups that we gave air cover to, just like if we intervene in Syria, the groups that we were giving air cover to in Libya are Islamist militant groups that were fighting against the regime, alongside with, the sort of like secular hipster rebels that you saw running around. There were also those Islamist groups.
Yeah.
And we gave them air cover, and they're there, and then there's been this power vacuum. And, Eastern Libya was the place that supplied the most jihadists into the Iraq war. And so we knew we should have known if we could talk about these things seriously. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you knew, but I don't think many people knew what we were getting into when we were saving that city. And it's a complicated world, and it just sort of goes to show how kind of bereft of any connection to reality our politics has become with, Darrell Issa's hearings on this, because this is a real serious issue that should be investigated, and we should be talking about the contractors and diplomatic security, and we can't get past the partisan politics of it to talk about the real issues.
And let me say, this diplomatic security point to me strikes me as really important, right? That we've taken this tack to outsource it. Now we've seen we saw what happened with Blackwater, and Jeremy Scahill, my colleague, your friend, reporting about what happened in Nisour Square and all of that. It strikes me that one of the things to think about is like actually reconstituting diplomatic security and bolstering it internally. And then the last thing I'll say, and this gets to the security question about the funding, right? And this can sound, I want to say this carefully. Right now in Washington, D.C., there are memos in every single department, from the Bureau of Land Management to diplomatic security to the National Security Agency, asking for more money. I mean, that is the background condition of every single bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. So it does not necessarily mean in all those cases that memo is correct. In this particular case where there was a request for more funding, it now appears retroactively it was correct and there was a wrong judgment made. But I think what ends up happening is in the wake of one of this, we see reporting that says there was an increase for more funding. But of course, the background condition in any and all cases right now across the entire United States government is that people are asking for more funding. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's leaping off the page to whoever is dealing with that request. Ali Gharib from the Daily Beast and Elise Jordan, former speechwriter for Condoleezza Rice. Great to have you guys here this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.
Obama doubles down on restraining defense spending. That's up next. President Obama did something remarkable in Tuesday's debate. Unprompted, he attacked his Republican opponent, Mitt Romney, for wanting to increase spending on national defense. President Obama raised the issue during an exchange over deficit reduction and Romney's proposed across-the-board tax cuts.
The cost of lowering rates for everybody across the board, 20%, along with what he also wants to do in terms of eliminating the estate tax, along with what he wants to do in terms of corporates, changes in the tax code, it costs about $5 trillion. Governor Romney then also wants to spend $2 trillion on additional military programs, even though the military is not asking for them. That's $7 trillion.
What's extraordinary about that moment and the president's position on defense spending in general is not just his promise to keep Pentagon spending flat over the next 10 years. It's the Obama campaign has clearly calculated that there's a political cost to Romney's call for an additional $2 trillion in defense spending. Romney, in fact, has said that defense spending, get this, should be pegged automatically at 4% of gross domestic product. This despite the fact that the threats the U.S. might face don't expand or contract in direct proportion to our GDP. But if the president thinks he has the better part of the political argument over defense spending, so does Mitt Romney. He has hit the president repeatedly over the administration's proposed leveling of defense spending. The polling, however, would seem to suggest the president does indeed have the upper hand. A Gallup poll earlier this year found that 41% of Americans think we're spending too much on defense, while only 24% say we're spending too little. So after a decade of explosive growth in spending on wars, defense, and security, Americans seem now to be reconsidering the wisdom of deeming the Pentagon budget politically untouchable, as it has been for the duration of our long war on terror. On top of that, the sequestration cuts mandated by last year's deal to resolve the debt ceiling crisis mean defense spending will be cut by more than $50 billion next year unless Congress settles on a long-term deficit reduction deal before the end of the year. That, along with the sea change in attitudes on defense spending among Americans, and Democrats in particular, would seem to provide us with the first occasion in a long time for a real debate on the size, scope, and cost of the American military. Joining us now is Larry Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan, and Sonali Kolhatkar, host of Uprising, which can be heard on KPFK Pacifica Radio, and co-director of the Afghan Women's Mission. Great to have you guys here. I want to start with a quote from George McGovern, who departed this morning, and an open letter that he wrote to President Obama upon President Obama's inauguration. George McGovern: when I entered the U.S. Senate in 1963, the defense budget was $51 billion. This was at a time when our military experts felt it necessary to have the means to win a war against the combined powers of Russia and China. Today, we have a military budget over $700 billion. That's including the funding for the wars. And yet neither Russia nor China threatens us, if indeed they ever did, nor does any other nation. I think the amount of spending increase in the last 10 years, I think people haven't quite gotten their heads around. It's essentially, even when you take out the war funding, if I'm not mistaken, we've seen a doubling of just the base budget of the Pentagon over the last 10 years. And we now have we have a very clear distinction in this campaign, as far as I can tell, in the plan of how that spending is going to go forward. We have a graph, I think, that shows this. This is the options on the table. The green line is Mitt Romney's idea about what this is base spending. This doesn't include wars. This doesn't include security. This doesn't the Department of Homeland Security. If you talk about security spending, you get an even larger amount of money. Barack Obama's proposed leveling and then the sequestration. Larry, you've worked on this issue for a long time. What has changed?
Well, what has changed, and I think the late Senator McGovern pointed it out, we don't have an existential threat. Yes, we have a threat with terrorism, but it's not something that you're going to win, with a lot of nuclear weapons or, huge armies and navies. And when you tell people, even Republicans, that if you control for inflation, take the base budget under sequestration, you'll go back to where you were in 2007. Nobody was complaining then. And the other thing is that even with sequestration, now I don't think we should do it automatically, but I think you can do it correctly, you're above what we spent on average controlling for inflation in the Cold War. And if you add war funding spending, and remember, this is the first time we've ever separated it out. In Korea and Vietnam, it
was all part of the same thing.
That's right. If you add in war funding, we're higher, again, in real terms, controlling for inflation, than at any time since World War II. Right. So, and when you tell people that, so wait a second. And the other thing that people don't understand is if you allow the Pentagon to have what Bob Gates called a gusher of defense spending, people won't make hard choices. And you can have everything. And you can take a look at over the last 10 years, the General Accountability Office looked and they said, your 95 weapon systems, a cost growth of $400 billion. John McCain, it says, a scandal and a tragedy. $50 billion on weapons we canceled. So really, and then the final thing, which is interesting, if we keep, we're 40% of the world's military expenditures. We got up to 50 at the height of the Cold War. You're going to have free riders. The Europeans say, well, why should we have to worry? The United States is going to, take care of us.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're also missing is that ordinary Americans want to know what percentage of my income dollars go into military spending, and nobody discusses that. If you look at that, about half of our income tax dollars, go towards military spending. And you can't count Social Security because that's a trust fund. That's something we pay into.
And we pay
You have to count past wars. You have to count veterans' benefits. That's all part of war spending. You have to count the interest on the debt that we've gone into for war. And when you tell ordinary people that, I think if they knew that number, 41%, would be even higher. The other thing, and I'm glad you use the term leveling when you talk about these issues, what Obama's plan is, because the press is mostly talking about cuts.
Yes,
and it's not cuts. It's still, if someone told you were getting a pay cut, you would really be getting a pay cut. You wouldn't be losing your raises, which is essentially what.
And we should say the leveling that we showed, that chart. Can we show that chart again? This, just so that people are clear, and this is a distinction that's important. This is in real dollars, not nominal dollars, which means there are in nominal dollars, which means in the actual price tag that's on the budget, they go up every year to keep pace with inflation. So that leveling is an actual leveling in real dollars.
You know, there's actually nobody wants a stronger defense than I do. I mean, 31 years in the United States military, you want your soldiers to go over there and come back, having accomplished the mission with the tools they need. But that said, to Larry's point, two other things have changed. Our capability within one ship alone is so much more. An aircraft carrier today can do 9 times the strikes in 24 hours, 9 times the targets in 24 hours than that same aircraft carrier could do just 15 years ago. Because the new domain of warfare is knowledge, the ability to have satellites pick up where the adversary is and link it real time to our aircraft going on. So therefore, it's not how many ships, how many fighter aircraft you have, it's capability with the knowledge. Number 2 is accountability. Everyone wants accountability in our spending. But take that aircraft carrier.
If I might object, not everyone wants accountability in our spending, particularly in our security spending. There is an industry of contractors that would very much, thank you very much, not like to have accountability.
Let's just say that the people in Elks County and Pennsylvania won. And so therefore, when you see that in that aircraft carrier that was asked for a few years ago of $11 billion, that the confidence factor that that price was right on internal Navy documents was about 35%. Would you buy a car if the car dealer said the price you've got to pay for that car next year is roughly a third of what I'm going to tell you, and you just pay me next year? In short, that's why we have cost overruns 2008 of $300 billion, because we have this tyranny of optimism. The price that we give forward is going to be right. We need accountability.
But of course, the argument on the other side, and this is the arguments made all the time, is that there are jobs attached to every one of those cost overruns. There's someone building those things. And I want to show an ad Mitt Romney is running, because this is where he thinks he's on strongest footing in weighting this politically when we come back.
This president can ask us to be patient. This president can tell us it was someone else's fault. But this president cannot tell us that you're better off today than when he took office.
Here in Colorado, we're not better off under President Obama. His defense cuts will weaken national security and threaten nearly 20,000 jobs. Romney's plan? Reverse Obama defense cuts, strengthen our military, and create over 200,000 new jobs for Colorado.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
Some good old-fashioned military Keynesianism from Mitt Romney. Government spending does not create jobs.
Rolling it over in his grave, listening to those things.
Yeah, I mean, this has obviously been the standard Republican line, forever, which is that government can't create jobs except if government jobs are defense-related. Anne-Marie, my sense is that you're supportive of the basic contours of the Obama trajectory for defense spending.
Absolutely. And I mean, I actually I'm not in support of sequestration and simply cutting $50 billion across the top. I mean, I think we actually need to figure out what the threats are and relate our spending to the threats. But that said, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullins, said back in 2009 that the deficit was the greatest threat to our national security, that we needed to rebuild our strength at home. We needed to rebuild our health and our education and our infrastructure. And that's part of what we need to be strong in the world. And the other part, going back to our discussion on Libya, $50 billion is the entire budget for the State Department, pretty much.
Yeah.
Right? We need more diplomats. We need more development. We need more of all the other kinds of ways in which we advance America's interests in the world. And the Pentagon actually understands that. When you look at what we needed in Afghanistan, it's not more soldiers. It's more of the rest of our security.
Because that way you can. I'm sorry.
So, Nali, I'm curious if you think that the Obama trajectory is aggressive enough.
Well, look, when you compare Obama to Romney, he comes out looking like a peacenik. But if you look at Obama in absolute terms, it's true that he wants to fight leaner wars. He wants a leaner military, but that's because drones are cheaper, more efficient. And is that what we want? I mean, what do ordinary Americans want? Most Americans are sick of war. Most Americans want international cooperation. So I agree with Anne-Marie about diplomacy being important. Although in the past, U.S. diplomacy has been more of a sledgehammer rather than a velvet glove.
We'll talk about that next.
But I think it is really important that when we look at Obama and his trimming of the military budget, it's not because it's not going to lead to us fighting fewer wars necessarily. It may mean fewer boots on the ground, and that's good for Americans not losing lives, but it's not going to mean fewer other lives being lost, because he wants to invest more in drones. drones. He has expanded the drone war far beyond Bush. This is not a president. This is a president who sees American interests and goes after them. He may not want to get involved in wars that he doesn't see American interests in directly, but it doesn't mean that he is a peace president. He never has been, and he won't be.
You know, it's interesting. After every buildup, when I worked for Reagan, we went up for 4 years by 28% in real terms. Then we had a deficit problem. We came down 10% in real terms over 4 years. Sequestration is only 8% reduction from where you are.
Right. And people are running around Capitol Hill like it's the end of the American project.
It's going to make us not the strongest nation.
And if you go back and you take a look, as Mark Shields calls him, our last liberal president, Richard Nixon, he cut 30% in 4 years. 30% in real terms. And he started EPA and OSHA and all the other things Republicans are complaining about. And going back to the point Anne Marie's made, Admiral Mullen, Secretary Gates said, well, deficit's a big problem. We need to spend more on state. But when you ask them, you want to take them from defense. Oh, no, we don't want to cut. And that's what we need. We need a unified national security budget that looks at state, homeland security, and defense and make those trade-offs.
Because those other elements of our power can actually prevent war. But the point is, it would be a real shame to say that we are going to continue to build or retake, as Romney wants to, an F-22 that's not needed because of a job. Because that's not what the warrior out there wants to hear. And when you really look at his numbers, Chris, they're really something. There's 3.5 million jobs in the defense and aerospace industry. According to what Mr. Romney is saying, this 10% cut in our defense budget, even if you do sequestration, would mean you lose 40% of all those jobs. That's ridiculous. And so the numbers don't even add up.
Well, when the defense spending went up in the last 5 years before you had the Budget Control Act, these companies were laying off people.
Right.
They had less. And if you take $1 and you say, I'm going to spend that on defense, education, health, or even a tax cut, you create more jobs.
Well, that's part of the issue. We actually talked about this in mining yesterday, right? A lot of this defense spending is incredibly capital-intensive undertaking as opposed to labor-intensive, right? If you spend $1, right, it depends on where you put that dollar. If it's a very capital-intensive industry, a very labor-intensive industry, things like healthcare and education are very labor-intensive. Things like building nuclear submarines is very capital-intensive. And so, in terms of the job creation potential per bang of buck,
healthcare.
One of the things that's fascinating. is that American public opinion on this has fluctuated more than I thought it would. I want to show you some of the data on that when we get back. So, having come of age post 9/11 as an adult and as a reporter, I think I had come under the impression that the sacredness, the sanctity of the defense budget was a fixture in American politics. But actually, this polling I thought was really interesting. This is basically U.S. views on defense spending, and from 1969 to 2012, and they're actually quite volatile. So during certain periods, you see us saying we're spending too much. For instance, in the post-Reagan buildup, and then what happens is the policy seems to adjust. We spend too much. There were defense cuts towards the latter part of the Reagan years. There's the Cold War dividend that we take. And then you see we're spending too little after 9/11. And now we're back to spending too much. And to hit this point home, take a look at this moment that our segment producer, Sal Gentile, found from the 2000 debate between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Take a look.
I propose $100 billion for this purpose. The governor proposes $45 billion. I propose more than twice as much because I think it's needed.
Governor Bush, 2 minutes.
If this were a spending contest, I'd come in second. I readily admit I'm not going to grow the size of the federal government like he is. I'm concerned that we're over-deployed around the world. Spending money is one thing, but spending money without a strategic plan can oftentimes be wasted.
The subject there was defense spending specifically, and remarkably, that Al Gore was to the right of George W. Bush. George W. Bush was attacking his opponent for wanting to spend too much money on defense, and that. I guess the point there is that there is much more. The American public is more malleable and more persuadable, I think, on this than I would have guessed.
But also, what George Bush said is strategic planning. We do not have the new strategic approach. What is our strategy for the future? Since Colin Powell's days, the early 90s, it used to be based on the defense of the two most stressing scenarios we had. Iraq, which is now gone, and the defense of South Korea, where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says we don't need the Army to defend South Korea anymore. So what are we measuring our military towards? Okay, we got some concerns about China that's coming onto the world scene and claiming East and the South China Sea are its inland waterways almost. And there's terrorism, but our defense, Quadrennial Defense Review, still says two stressing scenarios. We don't have a name for them. So we're still building two militaries for two major regional conflicts.
And
we don't have the right strategy.
We have essentially plugged into that same budget a generic conflict.
Just last year was that decision.
You know, I think what's happening here is the Republicans are trying to find some way in which they can find a context to say we want to create jobs.
Yes, that's true.
They don't want to do it through government, but of course, as you said earlier, the military is considered separate from government. It was interesting to hear George W. Bush be more of a classic conservative, saying that government spending. I don't want to increase the size of government. Romney seems to have no problem with increasing the size of government when it comes to the military. But I think again, it's this issue of jobs because that's what Americans want to hear.
Right.
He's going to be bringing that up on Monday as well, because people's eyes will glaze over when we talk about conflicts very far away in the world that don't seem to concern their own lives. He's going to try to hit it home with the issue of jobs.
And it's particularly, we should note, it's particularly important in swing states, right? I mean,
absolutely.
In some ways, the whole thing might just be about Virginia, which a huge amount of the Virginia economy revolves around both the defense contractors and the
If Obama's smart, he'll expose that.
You know why George Bush was talking about cutting defense spending? The point that the Admiral made earlier. He said technology is going to substitute for this. He had what they call the revolution in military.
This is the Rumsfeld vision.
Yeah, and basically he was arguing that the Democrats had not, not supported that. And I think that's what people, forget. Then, of course, after 9/11, they forgot everything and just, as Bob Gates said, opened up the spigots of, defense spending.
Here's the thing. I think that the broader point, and I was looking at the chart, which we don't have of in real dollars, not as a percentage of GDP, but in real dollars, how our security spending happened. Huge bump for the Cold War. It came down a bit, but that actually created a new baseline, and now we've added the war on terror atop that. And so now we have these two bumps sitting against each other. And the point is, we need to reassess. We can't keep building security architecture on top of each other and never actually go back and deconstruct the old security architecture.
Particularly when you're building on force structure, not capability in the knowledge domain.
I want to thank Larry Korb of the Center for American Progress and former Congressman Joe Sestak for joining us this morning. Great pleasure. Have the United States and Iran agreed to bilateral nuclear talks? The New York Times says yes, but the White House denies it. That's next.